So King David danced. David and all the people were dancing before God with all their might. Now we know a bit about David's story, even if we've only seen the movies. There's a lot of contrasts in David's story. There's these moments of joy, being anointed king and dancing, bringing the ark of God back to the center of worship, the center of religious life. Building toward these moments for a long time, David has been waiting because it's been a long time since he first knew that he would become king. He has been biding his time. He has been anticipating, and some others have been too. We have a lot more stories about David in our Hebrew Bible than stories about anyone else. And I'm not going to be able to remind us of all of them this morning, but I'm going to mention a few. You'll remember last week we were talking about Ruth, and she had just given birth to Obed, who was to be David's grandfather. And that's the first time we hear of David. We haven't known yet that he was coming. And when we first meet David himself, he's a young man, a lad, a teenager. We don't know exactly how old, but certainly not yet adult. And he's out tending sheep. And God sends Samuel to anoint him as king. Saul is still king and will be king for many more years to come. But God has withdrawn God's favor from Saul, and things start to go badly for Saul. Now, next time we see David, he kills Goliath. Or he's playing harp for Saul. Saul has periods of anguish, and David eases them with his music. He leads the army in battle. He's a very successful warrior. He serves Saul all this time. He marries Saul's daughter, Michal, and then Saul decides that David must be killed. He tries himself and fails. He tries to get other people to do it. They fail. And David flees, and he becomes essentially a bandit. He becomes essentially a bandit, and he is leading a group of men, maybe some women too, out in the hill country, places where they can hide in caves. And this goes on for a long time. And then he lives with the Philistine country for a while. But then Saul and Jonathan are killed in battle. So David returns to Hebron in Judah, where the Judahites crown him king, they anoint him. But most of the Israelites, the people who are called Israel in this story, the other tribes, are still loyal to Saul and to Saul's family. So we've got a little tension going on here. But gradually, all of the likely leaders of the other tribes die or are killed. And so the Israelites, as we heard in our story here, come to David and say, "We will anoint you king." It's not full-hearted, but it is acknowledged. So it's been 7 years since David was first anointed king in Judah. Now he's been anointed king over all Israel. And in between our two passages, David and the troops go and capture Jerusalem, which was not part of any tribe's territory. It belonged to the Jebusites at the time, but it is a well-defended territory, a good place for a capital city. So David and his troops claim that city, and that's why they're bringing the Ark of God to Jerusalem. These are peak moments in the life of David. Things have been building, accumulating. There have been challenges and difficulties and threats to his life. There have been many battles, many warriors killed. Many people killed in the towns as different groups try to take over someone else's town. It's a time of war. But here's a moment of peace. While they head toward Jerusalem with the Ark of God that contains the teachings of God and is understood that God travels with this Ark. Where that Ark is, God will be too. Now, it's maybe a quarter of the way through David's story that we are now. There's many more stories to be told, and I'm only going to mention a couple, but all of it reveals ultimately that David is not what you would call an ideal character. He's not yet perfect, and he never will be. He is God's chosen, God's anointed. God continues to stand behind David, and yet he's not perfect at all. He's an excellent, very skillful political and military leader. He can maneuver people into the position where he wants them politically. He leads the troops in battle, or he chooses good commanders. Very skillful. Within his family, there's a lot of trouble. But none of those, little of that family trouble has happened yet. And so this is a time to dance. You know, there's no waiting till we have everything right before we dance. No need to wait. If there's a moment to dance, let's dance. So on the surface, these stories that we heard today are about anointing and dancing. At a little deeper level, they're about this moment of transition where David is changing from being an outlaw warlord to the king of Judah, to the king of all Israel. He's had a lot of challenging experiences and a lot of conflict. And in the future parts of the David story, I'll just remind us of a couple. You might remember Bathsheba, who was the wife of Uriah when David commanded her to come to the palace where he had sex with her. Some consider that rape. Many wars and conquests. His son Absalom attempts a coup. Absalom is killed in battle, and David mourns. Mourning anyway. David has been mourning throughout all these times. Even when he's mourning, David does dance. He was mourning Saul and Jonathan when he was first anointed in Judah. He's mourning members of the house of Saul when he's anointed by Israel. And David's dynasty does continue for a couple hundred years into the future. And one of the important things about David for us is the word in Hebrew, Mashiach, becomes our word Messiah. It means anointed, and anointed could mean anointed as a king, anointed as a priest, anointed as a leader, but it begins to have the flavor that Messiah had by the time of Jesus, which was the one who will save Israel. So David's dancing, and maybe we can identify with David a little bit. We don't like to identify with everything in him, but, we too have found moments when we were not quite perfect, where we didn't treat others well, or where we forgot something, or broke something, or where we made a mistake. We've all had those moments. And yet, there's still this opportunity for dancing. Our own battles, our own families, our helpful choices and less helpful choices, all of these bring us into this present moment when this is a good time to dance. And there are more. In these weeks, I can't help but read in the David stories echoes of the current battle between Palestine and Israel, the current battles, the struggle which has been going on, depending how you count it, a couple weeks or since 2014 or 2007 or 1967 or 1948, there has been tension between these peoples. And the people of Israel have dominated, and the people of Palestine have been pushed into a corner. We can't compare either the Palestine or the Israel of today to our biblical characters. But we can remember that this part of the world, the place where our traditions began, the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition began, and which is also central to the Muslim tradition. These places become holy places. And when we have holy places, we start to have this feeling that we want to hold on. We want it to be ours and ours alone. There's battles in Russia and Ukraine, Yemen, Sudan. There are ongoing military conflicts all over the world and power conflicts. This is a story long told. And we accept that our own leaders in these times are also humans like David. We all are humans like David. We all experience the human condition of fallibility, the human capacity for joy and dancing, the human capacity to grieve and to mourn. We all have all these parts of being human. And I've been wondering, how can our understanding of the call of Jesus to live for peace, to feed everyone, to house the homeless, to visit those in prison, to heal the ill, to lead wisely, how can we ourselves live into that call in these times? Well, I think these times are a call to act. And first, I think, like bringing the ark to Jerusalem, the ark that contains the covenant between God and Israel, like bringing the ark, it's a time when we can commit ourselves and recommit ourselves to this faith that has brought us this far, to the love and justice, to the peace and joy that our faith proclaims. That recommitment is different for each one of us, but it is a moment when we get to sit back and bring that ark home to where we are. You know, we don't express things in exactly the same way they did in those days. Our language can be different. You heard all the names for God in our call to worship, none of them sounding like the word God. We forget that God is a metaphor. All the names and labels that we have for whatever is holy, it's all metaphors. And as we live with the metaphors and practice with the metaphors, we get to see different aspects of what it is that we commit ourselves to and who or what or how we are drawn along and supported in our efforts, in our willingness to live. You know, there's a literal dance here. Dance with the Spirit. Play your tambourines. But there's a metaphor for dance too. Dance can be something that our heart does. Our heart takes a leap when we see a dear friend. Dance can be something in our taste buds when we taste something delicious. Dance can be in our ears when we hear a harp or a piano or an organ or a singing voice. Dance can be when our eyes rest on something beautiful and say, ah, wow, ah. Many ways to dance. But one thing that happens when we dance is we become a little more awake. We become a little more aware of all that we have been given, of all that is around us. A little more present to the people who share our spaces, who share our world. And one thing that's good about dancing is it kind of gets you moving. It gets you going. It somehow, wanting to keep up with the beat, it gives a certain motivation, a certain urgency. We can use that sometimes. In our individual lives, for sure, and in our lives together. I was reading this week an interview with a peace worker in Israel who's part of a large team of people that includes Jews and Christians and Muslims and people perhaps of no faith who have been working together and getting to know each other for many years. And of course, in this tragic time, this circle of people who know each other, who may well know someone who has been killed or who has been called to kill as a member of the army. I read a quote from a rabbi part of that group who said, whose young son had just been called up into the military. He hadn't even finished his training, and yet he was sent out to the front. And he said, and I love the Palestinians. His grief over the whole situation just filling his soul and sharing with everyone in the room the tragedy. Because it's our capacity to respond to each other, our ability to hear each other's voices, see each other's faces, each other's lives, to welcome each other, no matter who we are or where we've come from. That's our capacity. There's an urgency in that capacity now. To respond to our community here, to respond to people all over the world, to respond to the earth. One thing that an organization called CMEP, Churches for Middle East Peace, tells us is praying is important, and also writing to our government representatives. in Congress, in the Senate, in the White House, in our state offices, reminding them of our commitments to peace and justice for all. That this is not a time to try to destroy one people or to seek revenge. There is a group of people in the biblical stories. They first show up when the Israelites are coming from Egypt, and they do not welcome the Israelites as they pass through their territory. And so these have become enemies. And when Saul is king, God tells him to go and to eliminate every living thing among the Amalekites. Every man, woman, child, every animal, cut down their trees, burn their treasures, leave everything there, bring no booty back. Saul does that, almost. But then he brings back with him the best of the lambs and the goats and the cattle for sacrifice. And he brings back the king. And in that story, Saul's unwillingness to follow through on God's instructions, that is what leads to God's dissatisfaction with Saul. Later, David encounters the Amalekites after they have raided the town where he's been living and his troops while they were out in the field. They took the women and the children and everything of worth. So David and his troops pursue them, try to capture and destroy all the people, but 400 men escape on camels. And so what we see in these stories as this attempt to totally eliminate your enemy, it simply cannot be achieved. It just builds and builds the anger, the resentment, the desire for vengeance. The biblical stories remind us again and again that peace is the better way, that communication, negotiation is the better way. It's hard to know if our actions in this regard will have any major effect. It's hard to know. They're still worth doing. It's still worth saying out loud that we support both the Palestinian and the Israeli people, and that war is not the way to resolve these issues. That there are many underlying grievances behind each action that the Palestinian Hamas group take and that the Israeli military takes. These must be talked through and resolved. That won't be our role, but there may be similar roles for us in our own communities, our own workplaces, our own schools, even within our own families. So it's an invitation to dance, isn't it? King David danced. David and all the people who were with him were dancing before God with all their might. It was a time of peace, a time of celebration even while mourning. Go ahead and dance anyway. Because, as John O'Donohue reminds us, now is the time to free the heart, to free the joy inside the self, to awaken to the wonder of your life. So let us dance, let us sing, This now, this is now, this is life. This, all of this is life. So we welcome now an anthem